He had everything money could buy, but he felt that something was missing. What would lead a millionaire to abandon his world of luxury to disguise himself as a simple mechanic in a neighborhood workshop? What he discovered there changed his life forever, and it might change yours too. Get ready for a surprising twist, where dark secrets and unexpected acts of kindness will challenge everything you believe about power, honesty, and the value of true human connection. You are about to witness a story that will stir your heart and mind. Check if you are already subscribed to the channel and see what happens when someone who has everything decides to go beyond himself. Lionel Venturi, owner of an immeasurable fortune, lived a life that many could only dream of. Mansions, luxury cars, extravagant parties. But behind all this, there was a void that money couldn't fill. It was as if he, surrounded by wealth, was becoming increasingly distant from what truly mattered. The faces of the people around him seemed more and more false, the conversations superficial. He missed something genuine, real, something that his fortune could not buy. One night, sitting in his quiet room, Lionel realized he needed a change. But it wasn't just any change. He wanted something profound, something that would connect him to the roots of ordinary life, to the people who struggled every day to survive. He wanted to understand what life was like for those who didn't have the same opportunities as he did. After all, what good was owning an empire if he didn't understand the reality of those who made the system work? Then, in a completely unexpected turn, a bold idea took hold of his mind. He would disguise himself as a mechanic and work in a small workshop. No expensive suits, no influential contacts, just an ordinary man dealing with common problems. For a few days, he would live the life he had only known from stories told by others. And no one, absolutely no one, would know his true identity. The next day, Lionel put his plan into action. He left his sophisticated attire and meticulously planned routine behind. Instead, he donned a simple work overalls, bought some old tools, and under a false name Nico, set off for a workshop in the city suburbs, a place he knew was far from the eyes of the elite with whom he mingled. Upon arrival, Lionel was met with a scene quite different from the luxurious offices he was accustomed to. The workshop was simple, dirty, with the smell of oil and grease permeating the air. There was a constant bustle of people and cars, and the sounds of metal clanking and engines roaring filled the environment. For the first time in years, he felt something different. It was as if he was finally in the real world where people had to fight for every penny. The workshop owner, Carlos, a middle-aged man with a stern and skeptical look, scanned him from head to toe. "Do you know how to work on cars, kid?" he asked, frowning. Lionel, or rather Nico, nodded. It wasn't a complete lie. He had learned some things about mechanics when he was young, but now it all seemed so distant. Even so, he was willing to try to get dirty, and to experience what it was like to work for real. And so began his journey. That day, Lionel felt the weight of physical exhaustion for the first time in a long time. His muscles ached, his hands were covered in grease, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of satisfaction. He was indeed living like ordinary people, without privileges, without titles. Gradually, his millionaire mask fell away, and he saw himself only as Nico, just another mechanic in a workshop on the outskirts of the city. The first day in the workshop was a real shock for Lionel Venturi. Accustomed to the comfort of luxurious offices and meetings where his word was law, now he was simply Nico, an ordinary man looking for a job. As he entered the workshop, he felt the suspicious glances of the other mechanics. His new work clothes and callous-free hands revealed that he did not belong to that world. The smell of burnt oil and grease permeated the air. The old tools, the dented cars, and the constant sound of hammering created a scene far removed from the tranquil and controlled environment of his boardrooms. Carlos, the workshop supervisor, watched him from a distance, arms crossed, not making much effort to hide his distrust. "You said you've worked with this before?" Carlos asked with a firm and skeptical look. "Yes, I've worked on cars a few times," Lionel replied, trying to stay calm. It was partially true. Years ago, when he was young, he had learned the basics, but he was far from being an experienced mechanic. Still, he was determined to face the challenge. Carlos gave a mocking smile and said with irony, "Let's see then." Without wasting time, Carlos assigned Lionel the most complicated task of the day, fixing an engine that hadn't worked for weeks. It was as if he wanted to test him, to see how far this rookie could go. The other mechanics working around cast quick glances and whispered among themselves, curious to see what Nico would do. Lionel took a deep breath. He was used to challenges, but until that moment they had been business challenges, where he controlled everything with a simple decision or a well-placed word. Here, however, it was different. He would have to use his own hands, sweat for real, and learn everything from scratch. He felt the weight of the wrench, something so simple, yet it seemed completely strange to someone who just a few days ago lived surrounded by luxury. The work was hard. As he struggled to understand the tangle of parts, wires, and oil, Lionel began to notice something that had previously eluded him. The physical and mental effort required was immense. His arms ached, his back protested, and sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the grease. Every adjustment to the engine was a puzzle that demanded full concentration. It wasn't just about technique. It was about patience, persistence, and above all a strength that went beyond the body. Carlos watched him closely, waiting for the moment when Nico would ask to quit or request help. But Lionel did not do so. He pressed on, stumbling over his mistakes but always getting up and trying again. With every failure came a new attempt. With every misplaced part, he took a deep breath and adjusted again. The other mechanics, who at first were ready to laugh at him, began to approach, curious about the persistence of that novice. It was unusual for someone so new and inexperienced to take on such a difficult task and continue nonetheless. By the end of the day, the engine, though not completely repaired, had shown a sign of life, something it hadn't done in a long time. Lionel had achieved more than he expected, and despite all the exhaustion, there was an unexpected satisfaction in his chest. Carlos, though still skeptical, couldn't help but acknowledge the effort. "Good job, Nico. But tomorrow I want to see if you can handle another day," he said with a half smile, already preparing the next test. Lionel, or rather Nico, merely nodded. At that moment, he was beginning to understand what it truly meant to live without privileges. Their respect was earned through hard work, not money. And on that first day, he had taken the first step toward a journey that would transform not only his view of the world, but also his very essence. During the breaks at the shop, the atmosphere was completely different from the noise and hustle of the workshop floor. While the mechanics sat down for a quick snack or a few minutes of rest, conversations flowed naturally. It was during these moments that Nico, Lionel disguised as a mechanic, began to see the true face of the lives of those men working around him. He listened in silence, speaking less than he heard, trying to absorb every piece of reality that was offered to him. Unlike the meetings he attended as a millionaire, filled with technical terms and financial strategies, the conversations at the shop were full of truth. The fatigue was evident on his colleagues' faces, and their voices carried the weight of responsibilities he had never truly felt. Carlos, the supervisor, spoke about problems with his house mortgage, always worried about losing the only place his family called home. "The shop is all I have. If it fails, I don't know how I will support my kids," he said without drama, only with the raw reality of someone living on the financial edge. Beside him, Joao, a younger mechanic, talked about the struggle to pay for his sister's college tuition. "I swear she's going to leave this town one day and do something great. But for that, I have to hold it together here," he said, with tired but determined eyes. It was as if his daily sacrifice was a burden he carried with pride, even if it meant giving up his own dreams. Lionel listened to all of this in silence, trying to understand the weight of each word. He, who had always had everything within reach, had never stopped to consider the real effort these people made to simply survive. Each of them carried an invisible burden, and it hit him like a punch in the stomach. What for him were numbers on a spreadsheet, for these men were real life. Every decision he made in his office directly affected people like Carlos and Joao. One of the most revealing moments occurred when he heard Mario, another mechanic, share his frustrations with the lack of opportunities. "The truth is, no matter how hard we try, the system was made for us to stay down here," Mario said with a bitter look. He had the talent but had never had the chance to go beyond the shop. "I've always wanted to start my own business, but between paying the bills, the kids' school, and what's left for rent, there's nothing to save. It feels like we're just living to put out fires." These words reverberated in Lionel's mind. He remembered all the times he had signed contracts, fired employees, or closed branches without ever asking who was truly behind those numbers. For him, they were just statistics. For these men it was life. Lionel began to realize how distant he had always been from the reality of those who, indirectly, sustained his empire. During the long breaks, the mechanics talked about the future with a mixture of hope and resignation. Some dreamed of a change, others just wished to survive another month. All of them, in one way or another, had learned to accept that life offered no guarantees and that each day was a battle. For Lionel, this reality was hard to process. He had never needed to fight in the same way. His money had always been there, ready to solve any problem. But there in that shop, he was surrounded by men who lived a continuous struggle. These conversations transformed Lionel. He began to see beyond the money, beyond the contracts, beyond the numbers. He saw the humanity in the lives around him and for the first time, felt the impact of the decisions that he, and many others like him, made from above. He had built an empire that, in some way, depended on the calloused hands of those mechanics. And amid the laughter and confessions of his colleagues, Lionel began to feel small in the face of the greatness of the struggle those men faced every day. Pedro was a 19-year-old with a hopeful look and hands marked by hard work. He had recently started as an apprentice at the shop but already carried on his shoulders more than many men twice his age. His smile was shy, and the few words he exchanged with the other mechanics showed his insecurity. When Nico, Lionel in disguise, arrived at the shop, Pedro was one of the few who did not show immediate suspicion, perhaps because he himself knew what it was like to be new in a hostile environment. Gradually, Pedro began to approach Nico, finding in him someone with whom he could share his thoughts and feelings. The young man saw in Nico a companion, someone who seemed to understand the difficulties of a worker's life. Lionel, on the other hand, felt an unexpected connection with the young man, perhaps because he saw in him something he had lost over the years, the purity of a dream, even if it was trapped in the webs of reality. One afternoon, during a break between car repairs, Pedro sat down next to Nico. His eyes were fixed on the concrete floor of the workshop, and he seemed lost in thought. "Have you ever had a dream that seems impossible?" he asked, his voice low. Lionel, surprised by the question, nodded encouragingly for him to continue. Pedro sighed and began to speak. "I wanted to be an engineer. I've always liked machines since I was a child. I would take apart everything I came across. Watches, toys, even my dad's lawnmower engine. But life doesn't wait for our dreams, you know? My mother got sick, and my father left us when I was 10 years old. Since then I've had to help at home. I work here all day, and the little I earn goes to paying off my family's debts. There's nothing left for college. Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck with no way out." Those words hit Lionel like an avalanche. He, who had always had the world at his feet, had never faced the harshness of an unattainable dream. Seeing Pedro, so young and already so burdened by life, made him reflect on his own journey. Would he have achieved the same success if he were in the young man's place? Maybe not. Pedro carried a strength that Lionel had never needed to develop, the strength to persist, even when fate seemed to conspire against him. Pedro continued, "I try to save some money for a technical course, but something always happens that makes me spend the little I manage to save. It seems like the harder we fight, the more life pushes us back." Lionel, or rather Nico, felt the weight of Pedro's words. He knew that with a single check, he could completely change the young man's life. But at that moment he decided to simply listen. He knew that Pedro needed more than just money. He needed support, someone who believed in him. Days went by, and the friendship between Pedro and Nico grew. They worked side by side, and Pedro began to trust him in a way he had never trusted anyone before. In casual conversations, Pedro shared stories of his childhood, his passions, and most importantly, his fears. "I just wanted to give my mother a better life, you know? She has always worked so hard for me, and now seeing her sick and being unable to do anything, it tears me apart inside." Lionel, behind the disguise, felt Pedro's pain. He saw the despair beginning to settle in the young man's heart, and it affected him deeply. The millionaire, who had always believed that money could solve everything, began to realize that some wounds were much deeper, and that only genuine understanding and support could help heal them. Pedro had no idea that the man he shared his dreams and fears with was one of the most powerful in the city. To him, Nico was just a colleague, someone who understood the value of a hard day's work. And it was this simple and genuine connection that touched Lionel in a way he could never have imagined. Over time, Lionel began to feel a sense of duty towards Pedro. The young man represented all the people he, as a businessman, had failed to see over the years. All the workers who fought every day to support their families, while he lived in his bubble of privileges. Pedro was a reflection of an invisible society, and it deeply moved Lionel. The friendship Lionel formed with Pedro was a turning point in his life. He began to see the importance of being present, listening, and above all giving opportunities to those who truly deserved them. Pedro, unknowingly, was transforming the worldview of one of the richest men in the city, simply by being himself. 2 days had passed since Lionel, disguised as Nico, began working at the workshop. He was starting to feel like part of the place, even if temporarily. He had already created a connection with Pedro, and learned more than he had imagined about the lives of the mechanics. However, what he still didn't know was that something much darker was hiding behind the seemingly simple routine of the workshop. That morning, the atmosphere seemed more tense than usual. Carlos, the workshop supervisor, was pacing back and forth, giving short and direct orders. What caught Lionel's attention was the insidious way Carlos dealt with the customers. He spoke with a calmness that seemed almost rehearsed, explaining that their cars would need more repairs than expected. But something didn't add up. Lionel, who had always been a keen observer, began to notice that many of the issues Carlos mentioned didn't actually exist. It was during lunch break that the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Lionel was in the storeroom, organizing some tools, when he heard voices in the background. Carlos was talking to another mechanic, an older guy named Sergio, whom Lionel hadn't interacted with much. The voices were low, but he could hear enough to understand they were scheming something. This car is in good condition, but the owner doesn't know anything about mechanics. Let's say it needs a whole new suspension. He'll pay without questioning, Carlos said with a casual tone, as if talking about something routine. Lionel felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. As the voices continued, he realized that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Carlos and Sergio were involved in a scheme that deceived customers, charging for unnecessary repairs, and in some cases, even stealing parts from the vehicles. At that moment, Lionel understood why so many low-income families were trapped in cycles of debt. It was a dirty and cruel practice, where those who lacked technical knowledge were ruthlessly exploited. He saw with his own eyes the direct impact it had on ordinary people, those who trusted the workshop to fix what, for them, was one of their most valuable possessions, their cars. Throughout the day, he became more attentive. He saw how Carlos manipulated each customer, always with a friendly smile on his face, assuring them that he was merely doing the best for the vehicle. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. Several mechanics on the team were already aware of what was happening, but no one had the courage to confront Carlos. Everyone needed the job, and questioning the system could mean losing their employment. Lionel, however, could not remain passive. He observed how Carlos stole parts from the cars, selling them on the black market and replacing them with cheap, low-quality parts. All this was done with a chilling indifference, as if it were a routine matter. Lionel realized that the workshop was involved in something much larger than he had initially imagined. The breaking point came when an elderly woman arrived at the workshop with her old car. She was nervous, explaining that the vehicle was essential for her to visit her husband, who was hospitalized in another city. The car had some minor issues, but nothing that required major repairs. Nonetheless, Carlos, with his manipulative demeanor, convinced the woman that the car needed a series of expensive replacements. He made her believe that without them, the car might simply break down in the middle of the road. Lionel watched the scene with a lump in his throat. He could no longer ignore what was happening. It was not merely dishonesty. It was an exploitation that directly affected people's lives, especially the most vulnerable. Seeing the look of desperation on the woman's face, who barely had money for her husband's medications, was the trigger for him to make a decision. With his heart racing, Lionel knew he needed to act. He could no longer hide behind the disguise of Nico. Lionel felt the weight of the dilemma growing in his chest. Up until then, he had convinced himself that his experience disguised as a mechanic was merely a personal experiment, a way to understand the life of those living on the margins of society. But now, with the discovery of Carlos's crimes and the ruthless exploitation of the most vulnerable customers, he knew the situation was much larger than he had imagined. That night, in his small and modest rented apartment, Lionel sat at the table, his heart racing. The dilemma was clear. He could simply let it go, finish his mission of a few days, return to his luxurious office, and continue with his untouchable millionaire life. After all, it was the easier path. He would avoid getting involved in problems and no one would ever know his true identity. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the elderly woman, desperate, not knowing how she would pay for the repairs Carlos insisted were essential. He saw Pedro, the young apprentice, struggling to help his family, trapped in a cycle of debt. He saw ordinary people being exploited, deceived, suffering, all to sustain the workshop's corrupt scheme. He could not ignore what he had witnessed. He felt a moral weight growing inside him, an inner voice urging him to do something. It was no longer a matter of curiosity or understanding the other side of society. It was a matter of justice. And Lionel, no matter how powerful and distant he was, knew he could not passively watch while those who barely had money to live were being so cruelly harmed. He considered his options. He knew that by revealing himself and exposing the workshop, he would face consequences. Carlos was a cunning man, and he certainly had his own allies. But more than that, revealing himself as Lionel Venturi, the millionaire, would put his own image at risk. People might question his intentions. His journey of discovery could be seen as an arrogant whim, a game to satisfy his curiosity. But at the same time, he knew that life was not just about protecting his name or his wealth. It was about the impact he had on the world. And if, with his power and influence, he did not use his position to correct such an obvious injustice, what was the point of being a successful man? The next morning, Lionel returned to the workshop with a clearer head but still a heavy heart. He watched Carlos, who acted as if everything were normal, as if nothing he did was wrong. Pedro, unaware of the dirty scheme, continued to work hard, trying to do his best with the little he had. Lionel knew that this would be the day of decision. He could continue pretending to be Nico, completing his mission without drawing attention, or he could confront Carlos and risk everything. The look of each customer who entered the workshop reminded him of the devastating impact Carlos's actions had on their lives. And it was there, among the sounds of tools, engines, and conversations, that Lionel made his decision. He would no longer be a bystander. He would not let power blind him to reality. He was a millionaire, yes, but above all he was a man with a conscience, and it would not let him move forward without acting. Lionel decided that he would confront Carlos. The risk did not matter. It was time to end that cycle of exploitation and show that, even in the shadows of society, there was always room for justice. Lionel took a deep breath before approaching Carlos. The noise of the engines, the smell of oil and grease, and the stuffy atmosphere of the workshop seemed to amplify the weight of the moment. Each step he took towards the supervisor felt like carrying a decision larger than the previous one. Carlos, for his part, was in the corner of the workshop, gesticulating aggressively at one of the younger mechanics, clearly frustrated with something trivial. "We need to talk," said Lionel, trying to remain calm but feeling the weight of the impending confrontation. Carlos looked at Nico with disdain, as he always did. From the first day, he hadn't liked the new mechanic. Something about him deeply irritated Carlos, perhaps because Nico did not fit into the corrupt dynamics of the workshop. He was unlike the others. He didn't ask too many questions, but he also didn't blindly accept the things he saw. "What do you want?" Carlos replied, already impatient, without taking his eyes off his work. "If it's about the payroll, you'll have to wait." Lionel did not back down. He knew this was the moment to act.
No, Carlos.
"It's not about payment. It's about what you're doing here," Lionel said, his tone growing more serious. "I know about the stolen parts. I know how you deceive the customers. I know everything." Carlos stopped immediately, his jaw tense, his eyes narrowing. There was a palpable threat in the air. "You don't know anything," he growled, moving closer to Lionel. "And you'd better keep your mouth shut if you want to keep all your teeth." The tension was palpable. The other mechanics noticed the conversation and began to watch from a distance, pretending to remain busy with their tasks. Pedro, the young apprentice, looked on with a worried expression, Sensing that something serious was about to happen, Lionel, undeterred, continued, "It's too late, Carlos. Do you think you can keep doing this? Deceiving customers, destroying lives? I've seen enough in these 2 days to know that what you're doing here is wrong. And I'm not staying silent any longer." Carlos took a step forward threateningly. "Who do you think you are, Nico?" Sarcasm and anger dripped from his words. "A rookie mechanic? A nobody who just showed up and thinks he can dictate the rules? I run this workshop, and if you don't know your place, I can guarantee you'll learn quickly. If I were you, I'd start walking carefully." It was at that moment that Lionel realized there was no turning back. He knew the truth needed to be revealed. If he continued to hide behind his disguise, he would allow Carlos to keep destroying lives. And there, at that instant, the decision was made. Lionel straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and with surprising calm, looked directly into Carlos's eyes. "Who am I?" Lionel began, his voice now firm and controlled. "I am Lionel Venturi." Carlos stood still, his expression shifting between disbelief and confusion. "What?" Carlos murmured, trying to process what he had heard. "What did you say?" "I am Lionel Venturi," Lionel repeated with conviction. "Owner of several companies, including this workshop that you're destroying with your dirty schemes. I decided to disguise myself to see how my businesses operate from the inside. And now I see that you're stealing not just from me, but from innocent people who trust you. This ends here." Carlos took a step back, clearly shocked. He tried to find some excuse, some justification, but his mind was racing. The revelation left him speechless. He looked around as if seeking support from the other mechanics, but everyone was frozen, too surprised to react. This can't be true," Carlos stammered, trying to maintain his stance. "You're lying. A cheap trick." Lionel, now more confident than ever, walked over to Carlos's workbench, where the manager kept his papers and documents. He pulled out his own cell phone, unlocked the screen, and showed Carlos the evidence. His credentials, photos of his companies, emails he had exchanged as the owner of that network of workshops. Carlos saw it all, and within seconds, his expression changed from anger to sheer desperation. You really are," Carlos began, but his voice faltered. He knew he had lost. He knew his charade had come to an end. Lionel then looked around at the other employees who were watching in silence. "What is happening here ends now," he declared, his voice firm but full of purpose. "This workshop will undergo changes. The corruption I have seen in the past few days will no longer continue. Carlos, you're fired. And I will ensure that justice is done for everyone you have harmed." Carlos, still in shock, could not move. He knew his world had crumbled. Lionel, on the other hand, felt a weight lifted. He knew this confrontation was necessary, and now he could use his power to do what was right. After exposing all the corruption at the workshop and firing Carlos, Lionel knew that this was just the beginning. The workshop, with its illegal practices and lies, was destroying lives, but he also saw something bigger there, something that could be fixed. In particular, the life of Pedro, the young apprentice, who had such big dreams but seemed trapped in a cycle of poverty and frustration. With Carlos gone, Lionel did not waste any time. He knew he needed to act quickly to prevent more people from being harmed. He called a meeting with all the employees, who were still in shock after the revelation that Nico, the simple mechanic, was actually one of the most powerful men in the city. There was a mix of fear and relief in the air. "From now on, this workshop will operate differently," Lionel began, looking into the eyes of each person present. "There will be no more cheating, no more dishonesty. Here, those who will thrive are those who work hard and honestly." The employees listened in silence, many still trying to process everything that had happened. However, among them, Pedro's heart raced. He feared that with Carlos's downfall, he might also lose his job, his only source of income. But Lionel had other plans for the young man. He had observed Pedro closely, seen his dedication, and noticed that the young man had a spark in his eyes when he talked about his dreams. He was not someone who was merely resigned to what life gave him. Pedro wanted more, wanted to grow, study, and make a difference. And Lionel, with his experience and wisdom, knew that this kind of determination was rare. After the meeting, Lionel called Pedro in for a private conversation. The young man, nervous, did not know what to expect. Would he be fired? Did the wealthy man think he was complicit in Carlos's crimes? Pedro, I've seen how hard you work here, Lionel began, breaking the silence. And more than that, I've seen how much you dream of a better future. But I also know that the difficulties you face have been holding you back, preventing you from moving forward. Pedro, surprised, could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had always thought that his reality would never be noticed by anyone, especially by someone as powerful as Lionel. I want to help you, Lionel continued with a sincere look. You've told me about your desire to study, to have a profession that allows you to grow. And that's exactly what I'm going to do for you. Pedro could not hold back his tears. He had always dreamed of leaving the workshop, studying, and being more than that, but the weight of debts and responsibility for his family kept him trapped. That offer seemed like a dream too distant to be true. I'm going to give you a scholarship, Lionel said, smiling as he saw the surprise on the young man's face. You will be able to study advanced automotive mechanics or anything else you want, without worrying about money. And when you finish, I want you to come back here, but not as an apprentice. I want you to return as a supervisor, to lead this workshop the right way with no deceit, no tricks. Pedro was silent for a few seconds, unable to speak, his heart pounding in his chest. Never, not even in his wildest dreams, had he imagined something like this could happen. He was no longer the young man who only dreamed, but someone who now had a real chance to change his life and that of his family. I don't know what to say, Mr. Lionel, Pedro said, his voice trembling with emotion. This is going to change everything. My family, my mother. She's going to be so happy. I will work hard, I'll give my best, I promise. Lionel placed his hand on the young man's shoulder and smiled. I expect nothing less from you, Pedro. I know you will seize this opportunity and make a difference. Remember, sometimes a gesture, however small it may seem, can transform a life. And I believe you will do that with yours. And so the workshop, which had once been a place of corruption and dishonesty, began to transform. Carlos was brought to justice and faced the consequences of his actions, while Pedro, with Lionel's support, began studying and building a future he had never imagined possible. That simple act of generosity proved that when someone decides to make a difference, the changes are profound and real. And Lionel, now more aware of the realities of those around him, returned to his life as a businessman, but with a new perspective, that the power to help others is one of the greatest riches someone can have. The most valuable lesson from this story is that acts of kindness, no matter how small they may seem, have the power to create significant changes. Lionel not only changed Pedro's life, but also inspired others around him to seek a more honest and purposeful life. Sometimes an action that seems simple can be the starting point for a completely new future. And now, we invite you to continue following stories like this on our channel. Here we always strive to bring powerful life lessons that make us reflect and see the world with new eyes. Don't forget to subscribe, share with friends, and leave your comments. Your participation is what makes all of this worthwhile. Together, we can create a community inspired by moving and transformative stories.